Africa is holding its first climate summit. The aim is to decide how to tackle the continent's climate change challenges. But although African countries are ambitious about green development, can they go it alone? And do they have the money? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran. African nations are demanding climate justice. Their continent suffers the most from a warming planet and they want wealthy nations to help with the cost. That's why leaders have been gathering in Kenya for a first-of-its-kind summit on climate change. They want to unite in a single voice to strengthen their position on the global stage. We'll go to our panel in just a few moments, but first, Fintan Monaghan has this report.
African leaders gather for the first time, seeking joint action on climate change. While the focus was on the challenges facing the continent, host nation Kenya also pointed to the potential opportunities.
In Africa, we can be a green industrial hub that helps other regions achieve their net zero strategies by 2050. Unlocking the renewable resources that we have in our continent is not only good for Africa, it is good for the rest of the world.
According to the UN, Africa contributes around 2 to 3% of global emissions, but suffers the most from the changing climate. Extreme weather events like droughts and floods are becoming more frequent and have been linked to the deaths of thousands of people. African nations say they need funding to help mitigate the effects and smooth the transition to cleaner energy sources. More than $120 billion a year is needed, but it's only getting a fraction of that. The UN Secretary General is among those calling on rich nations to pay up.
I make a very strong appeal to the large emitters, to the G20 countries responsible for 80% of the emissions that will be meeting this week in Delhi. Assume your responsibilities.
But despite many such calls in the past, the world's biggest polluters have been reluctant to meet those demands. African nations will seek more commitments at the next UN climate conference at the end of the year. They're hoping a common position will strengthen their hand. Fintan Monaghan for Inside Story.
Let's meet our guest. In Nairobi is Maurice Onyango. Regional Head of Disaster Risk Management for Plan International. In Abuja is Ikenna Ofoegbu, Program Manager of Sustainable Nigeria Programs with Heinrich Boel Stiftung, an Africa policy think tank. And also in Nairobi is Serah, Africa Executive Director of the One Campaign. A warm welcome to you all. I want to begin in Nairobi with Serah first. This is a historic moment for the African continent. It's the first ever climate change summit. Now, Africa is responsible for about 2 to 3% of global emissions, yet it's the continent that's the worst affected. But the real challenge here for this particular summit is trying to come up with a unified agreement. Very simple question. Do you think they can do that?
I do. I think there is political will. I think that this inaugural climate summit has really awakened something in the leaders of Africa. They have come in their numbers, so there's a pretty impressive list of African leaders in the room, in spite of the fact that the G20 happening next week. There are a number of international guests in the room, from Secretary John Kerry from the United States all the way to Europe. I think that it feels different on the ground, to be honest. When you walk around the summit grounds, you see the Middle Easterners are representing their numbers, the Africans are representing their numbers as the hosts, Europeans are representing their numbers. I think political will is there. I think resource constraints are real. I think the impact of climate change is very real for Africa. I think we've been hit by a few areas that have tightened the fiscal space. Cost of living, inflation, the Ukraine and Russia war did not help. The pandemic really exacerbated a lot of things. So there is urgency of the situation, and there's political will to find solutions. So I think as there is a will, we will find a way.
Now, let me go to Abuja. Donald, where there's a will, there's a way, but that might not be the way that everybody's looking for, this optimism that we talk about, might not happen. There are still large oil-producing nations within Africa itself who are insisting that they need that money to develop their own nations. We're not unified right now, are we? Is that optimism a bit misplaced?
I think I'll apply a little bit of caution in terms of how much I want to put some optimism as to what's happening, largely because I think a lot of African countries are leaning too much of actions which we should be taking as a people on the West. When it comes to climate change, from my own perspective, I don't think a lot of our country as national countries are taking enough responsible actions. It's true that most of the emissions may not be coming from Africa, and it's also true that we're dealing with a lot of the effects of climate change, but measuring the reactions from our own countries, at least for Nigeria, for instance, I don't think we're taking enough actions to actually address the problem as it is. It's risky, it's dangerous to build narratives that puts the fate of Africa on the hands of the West. So I think leaning towards that trajectory, which is something I speculate is happening most, I think it's too risky. So I don't think I want to be too optimistic until I start to see more national African countries, creating and taking their own initiative to respond to the effects, rather than just really leaning on the West to meet up with their obligations, which so far has not been happening since Paris.
Let me go to Nairobi as well now. And Maurice, that idea that we do need to be careful about our optimism actually might well change in a few days' time if they do come up with these unified statements and a concrete plan. But those plans are ambitious. They want carbon offset programs. They want $120 billion a year. Where are you at this? Do you think it's going to happen?
I think it can happen because, as Serah has mentioned there, the general goodwill, the political goodwill is increasingly there. We are all recognizing the devastating effects of climate change. It is no longer a debate. It is something that is now fully recognized. And I think African governments are recognizing this. The global community are recognizing this. But I think the major part which has been a challenge is acting. I think we should move from a lot of talk and just act and invest in the right alternative financing models to sustain the green growth that we all aspire for. So I think the goodwill is there, the political goodwill is there. It's just a question of acting. We need to act now for us to really make any headway.
Serah, Maurice makes a very good point here. I mean, there is, like you say, seemingly the political will to get this done. There's a very important people in that room, as you say, but the elephant in the room is always big business, and big business does not want to change. And that's been a real problem. Now, we're looking at carbon offset programs, carbon offset investments, effectively encouraging businesses to invest in things like planting more trees, and then that way they can offset those investments with the things that they're doing, the G20 countries are doing. For example, 80% of the world's emissions come from G20 countries. Are these financial models, you think, sustainable for Africa?
So I think there have to be a lot more players than the private sector. One of the things that we're seeing is that the scale of the challenge is in trillions. So the Songwe-Stern-Batra report mentions that low and middle income countries need $2.4 trillion every year to combat the coalition of climate and development. So we can't get all of that from the private sector. It will have to come from domestic resource mobilized within government. It'll have to come from domestic private sector capital mobilized. It'll have to come from foreign investments as well as multilateral development banks. So these players need to come into the room. And right now there's a serious conversation about the African Carbon Market Initiative. And we believe that there's room for Africa to come with a common voice so that we can adequately price African carbon. Currently, when you stand up African carbon with carbon coming from other parts of the world, African carbon is cheaper and it's the same carbon. So the question is, are the methodologies defunct? Do we need to relook at that? What is the pricing mechanism? Can African countries get the revenue from A, absorbing carbon, and B, charging those who are polluting more to pay for the work we are doing on the continent of absorbing this carbon? So that's the constellation of conversations we're having. And so I do think there's a place for the private sector. I do think there's a place for the carbon markets, but I think we need a lot more tools in our toolkit.
Right. I saw you gesticulating. Maurice, I will come to you in just a quick second, but I want to come to Donald first. Firstly, let's talk about this idea that green business might be a way forward, particularly for the African continent. It is a continent where 400 million people don't have access to electricity on a regular basis, don't have access to clean water on a regular basis. But now we're asking the big business to kind of come in with these carbon offset programs. Is that the right way to go, do you think?
So for me, I think it's going to be a lot of questions around the ability of existing institutions in Africa to enforce and implement what is right. Dirty is cheap. And if dirty is cheap, it's good for big businesses. And I don't see big businesses actually just tilting the right way, going green just to provide more electricity. Who it's going to pay? A lot of African countries are living in huge debt. We know we may not be having a lot of debt forgiveness coming in very soon. And so a lot of these businesses are not running charity organizations. They want to make profits. Everybody's going to try to minimize costs as much as possible. So we don't have the institutions to enforce green sustainability business models and business measures. And I think this is what really disturbs my whatever level of optimism I have. And I don't think we have those institutions. I think we need to build those capacities first to ensure big businesses can do what is right. And then if we could take local initiatives to put more money in the pockets of poor households to be able to afford green electricity, then I think we'll be able to, get some real practical solutions. But until we get more households getting more incomes and real working institutions...
Sorry, Donald, I'm just going to stop you there because you've made a very interesting point that I want to put to Maurice. Maurice, this idea that you've got all, these ideas that are going to come from this summit, but you don't have the capacity, says Donald, within African institutions to be able to deliver on those. You simply don't have the institutions in place. Is that right?
No, I would disagree. I would disagree with that partially. I also agree with it to a certain extent. But these institutions need to be built. Where they don't exist, we need to build them. I think the narrative that Africa is powerless, the narrative that Africa doesn't have this, doesn't have that, I think that narrative we need to now also counter it and get the necessary support that is needed so that we build these institutions, we build the financing models and make sure that they are sustainable. We don't want to reach a situation where we are feeling extremely powerless. In the continent, the resources are there, but how are we exploiting those resources? How are we exploiting the manpower that we have? How are we dealing with the capacities that are in the continent? So I think that we need a concerted effort to build existing institutions, create institutions that where they are not existing, strengthen them where they are existing and they are weak, and then move on together. I wanted to highlight also another point around the problem is not just about the private sector. The problem is for us all. It is a problem that is impacting our children. At Plan International, we are seeing the impacts everywhere. The recent cyclones in Southern Africa, we are losing huge numbers of children in terms of a generation. So let us think of holistic solutions solutions that are going to bring strengthen institutions and make all of us move together in the right way.
Serah, we heard earlier, we heard from Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General. He was very blunt. He said the G20 nations need to pay up. They need to pay up $120 billion a year. There's a lot of donor fatigue right now. There are several problems, crises on the continent and indeed across the world where donors are being asked to front up money. And most of the time, what gets pledged at these conferences doesn't translate into money on the ground. Are you worried about that?
You know, there is a concern because it feels that the donor fatigue is based on we're doing Africa a favor. But I'd like to highlight that Africa's contribution to emissions is about 4%. So 96% comes from elsewhere. And what Africa is saying is, you have created this situation. You've contributed 96% to the situation. What we are bringing to the table is an ability to absorb and correct the situation through our natural assets, our critical green minerals, our young, innovative, youthful population. And what we need is capital. So it's not that donors are doing a favor to Africa. They're doing a favor for the whole world, including themselves. So yes, we understand that the constraints of capital are widespread. It's not just within the continent. Other countries have this situation. However, the call to action for the G20, for donor countries, is we need a mix of financing. So loss and damage funds should be adequately provided as grants, but Africa can get loans as well. But they need to be concessional. So we have a debt crisis on the continent of sorts, about 22 countries just in debt distress. What that means is when a country is making a decision between paying its teachers or servicing its debt, paying its nurses or servicing its debt, it doesn't have bandwidth to talk about climate and addressing all the challenges that are coming at it due to climate change. So there's an urgent need for multilateral development banks to create that the concessional loans for African countries. The G20 Commission and the experts have advised that the World Bank, the African Development Bank can triple the revenue base so that African countries and low and middle income countries can borrow more at concessional rates, as opposed to what we do now, which is lend money from the capital markets, and we're paying 5 times more to do that. So A, it's not charity, we're in this together, but B, we need available resources to tackle it. So it's not just grants, it's also loans, and it's also where the private sector comes in with equity contributions.
Do you know, it's really interesting, Serah, as you were talking, and when you just said this isn't Africa asking for a favour, this is not Africa with its begging bowl out, both our guests actually nodded furiously in agreement with you. Let me go to Nairobi first and to Maurice. This is the key change, I feel, that this summit, more than any other summit, is about saying, look, this is your fault and you need to come and help us, but we're not asking for a handout. Is that message getting across to the politicians from the G20 countries?
I think it is. The question is, are we listening and are we acting? Going back to what I was saying earlier, because even what Serah is mentioning there, we need multiplicity of solutions in terms of financing. We have not contributed, especially as Africa, very insignificant in terms of the impacts of climate change. So the key thing is, let us really act now and invest, put in the money in climate financing, put in the money in all these agreements that we have all along come up with, but we have not put the necessary resources to make them actualized. So I think that it's not a begging bowl situation. Let us simply put the money where it needs to be, because it is all affecting us. Africa is worst affected, and if we don't invest in some of these solutions, we are going to get into a more serious situation. Even when it comes to the forest cover and how we are doing the sequestering and all that, it's Africa that is even contributing the best in terms of that, the equatorial forests and all that. So let us put in our resources, the money necessary for making sure that we affect all these agreements and we move forward in the right way.
Donald, a slightly different question to you. The mechanisms that we've talked about so far, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, those are the mechanisms that, generally speaking, when they have come into countries, they've insisted on changes to the country's finance systems, austerity measures, for example. There is a cost to getting those people involved. And oftentimes that cost hits the most poorest people. And those measures become unpopular. Are you concerned then that the international finance community is perhaps going to be a bigger problem long term than this optimism that we see right now?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's been a long worry or complaint that large international organizations, financial loan conditions are largely not favorable. For subsidy removals, liberalizing the sectors, pushing sectors towards cash crops that are largely exported, changing farm systems. So to a large extent, yes. And these are some of the conditions and discussions. We hope that the African Climate Summit should strongly, go head on to discuss the conditions around climate financing, expanding borrowing nets, and seeing how we really get a little bit of more concessional funds that go favorably, to Africa and other developing countries. So, yeah, I think the IMF, the World Bank, I think they should really look into these mechanisms. Current mechanisms, I don't think they favor Africa so much. And I think we really should consider the conditions around the climate debt swap, and the rest of them. But I don't think current instruments are largely favorable. And if we don't address this, there will really largely be a big barrier as to how well we could address climate change if we're actually looking or leaning towards more international financing from the West.
Serah, I'll come to you in just a second, but Maurice, as Donald was speaking there, you were shaking your head. What did you disagree with?
No, it's not that I'm disagreeing. In fact, I wanted to really just affirm some of the points that he's mentioning. Even in the international finance system as we speak, you have had several of our presidents. In fact, the president of Kenya was mentioning even the other day that the amount of interest that even Africans are paying from global finance system is extremely high. And even when we come up with all these new mechanisms, let us come up with mechanisms, whether it is loans, whether it is grants, that are conducive, that are favorable to the African continent. Because the current system, it has a certain challenge in terms of the amount of money is calculated on risk basis, and the interests are just extremely out of this world.
Serah, we've concentrated on the actual summit itself, the financing of this $120 billion that the UN is looking for to help Africa with, how that might be given to Africa, what sort of financial instruments, private sector, public sector cooperation, all of that sort of stuff. But I want to get back to the actual real problems within Africa itself when it comes to the mistrust, that image that African politicians are corrupt. The G20, often when they say, we don't want to give any more money to Africa because we don't know whether it's going to get to the right people. It is an image problem that the African continent, as racist as that is, has. So how is this summit going to address that? Is it going to address the endemic, almost systematic racism towards Africa?
Yeah, so corruption is not purview of Africa alone, right? So that perception and narrative needs to change. We look across the Atlantic and we see corruption in many other jurisdictions, but somehow when it's African related, it gets amplified. So I think it's time for courageous and candid conversation that corruption is everywhere. However, let's come back home to what we can do as we're thinking about and working through resurrecting and actually building our continent. So two things that are going to be very important. One is including civil society and citizenry in the conversation about resources. Accountability by Africans of African governments are going to be really important. So it's not outsiders putting a lens on what Africa should or shouldn't do. It's the African citizens, oftentimes, that outlast the political timeline that need to be involved in this. And creating that atmosphere where African citizens and civil society can be part of that is a start. But the second as well is when we talked about domestic resource mobilization of the money that's required. I know there's a quote of 120 billion. There's another of 2.24 trillion. Of all that money required, 1.4 will need to come from Africa or come from the domestic side. So how are we're contributing also to this, the pot. We're not waiting for folks to just give us resources. We also have to generate resources internally. So how are we thinking creatively on the continent of generating those resources internally? It will have to do with taxation, unfortunately, illicit financial flows, and those need to be strengthened because oftentimes the funds come out of Africa to the West. So we have enablers and other jurisdictions that enable this illicit financial system to thrive. So when the blame comes solely in Africa, I feel like we need to share that a bit more. But more importantly than sharing the blame, we need to do actual things to mitigate the perception, sometimes the reality, but largely the perception of corruption. And that involves transparency, accountability.
Sorry, Serah, we are running out of time. I do want to come to our other guest just quickly. Here's the deal. You've got, 24 hours left of this summit. It's coming to a close very soon. There needs to be a joint, actionable statement that comes out of that that's going to satisfy all three of you. Just want to ask you, Donald, in Abuja, do you think that's going to happen? Is there a mission statement that's actionable, that will work, that will come out of this summit?
Yes, I think it's possible we can get some concrete resolutions that's implementable. But if I would want to be, if they are practical and they are nationally designed and our political leaders...
Sorry, Donald, we are running out of time, and I do want to come to our guest in Nairobi as well. I understand that you think there might be a statement. Maurice, what do you think? Will there be a joint actionable statement, just very quickly?
I operate from the side of optimism, and I believe that that is possible. We still have adequate time. It is possible. They are going to get something out. The key thing is, as I was mentioning earlier, let us all act and act fast, because we don't have time to really wait. And the time is just now for us to act and make sure that we can really turn the bend on this issue.
I want to thank all our guests. Serah Makka, Donald Ikenna Ofoegbu and Maurice Onyango. And thank you too for watching. Now, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.